Sadiq Khan, hello. How's it going?
Not bad at all, Ollie. Not bad at all. You okay? How you bearing up with COVID-19 and cabin fever and all that sort of
Yeah,
stuff?
I've been working from home for the last 2 weeks, so starting to go slightly crazy. Are you also you working from home? Are you isolated, or do you have to go out and about?
No, so I've deliberately for some time now been working from home. To set an example, actually, I mean, I think the advice aren't optional as far as I'm concerned. They're rules and they're instruction. So, I go out once a day to walk Luna, my wife and I, and but other than that, staying indoors. And it's really important all of us stay indoors. That's the best way to stop the virus spreading and fewer people dying.
That's one of the sort of concerning things I think I've seen in the way that the government's been handling this. It was only until very recently that the daily press conferences moved to digital conference calling. Before that, everyone was in that small room, including Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, and there are photos as well of them in the Commons not observing social distancing, very close together. Obviously, I wish the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary a speedy recovery, but is there a little bit of an element of, if you'd have followed the advice, if you'd have followed the guidelines, if you hadn't have been shaking hands with coronavirus patients in a hospital, perhaps you wouldn't have the disease now?
I mean, look, I don't want to be indiscreet, but one of the things I said to Boris Johnson when I last saw him face to face was, I think it's important for us to lead by example. And I made the point about his press conferences, but also the way Cobra was meeting. And I think it's important for us to realise, even though we may be younger and fitter than those who are vulnerable and the elderly, none of us is immune. And I think just human nature as it is, because we are younger than the group of people we are really worried about, we sort of do think we're superhuman. And look, I wish Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, anybody who's got the virus, all the best. I mean, none of us wants to see the Prime Minister out of action. The particular concern he must have as somebody whose partner is pregnant, is interaction with her, because pregnant women are like those with underlying health conditions and those who are older, we're worried about. And so it is important that we are all vigilant. And by the way, I've spoken to people who are younger and have had this virus. It ain't pleasant. It's not good. And that's why all of us should be vigilant. Still wash your hands thoroughly during the course of a day, even though you may be working from home. And it's really important to follow the advice from the experts. And just I'd remind all of us, this isn't there as an optional extra. These are rules and instructions that should be followed to genuinely save lives.
Can you impress upon our viewers now the sort of that importance, because obviously we've got a younger audience, and I've been out and about when I've gone for my government mandated daily exercise. I've been out for a walk with the dog, and I've seen young lads out playing football. And I think there is an element perhaps for younger people that they're not going to be affected by this virus as severely, and so it's okay then for them to go outside and to meet up in groups. And obviously that is not the case.
Look, I'm somebody who believes passionately about human rights and civil liberties. I spent a career as a lawyer practicing human rights law and civil liberties. One of the biggest ironies is I'm the guy who was lobbying the Prime Minister to move and be much firmer in relation to the need, because actually one of the most basic human rights we have is the right to life, is the right to be well. And all I say to Joe viewers is actually we've got to realise that actually none of us lives in isolation. We all by our actions have a ripple effect in relation to the impact of this virus. And genuinely, I'm not just saying this because I like lecturing people because I'm a dad and all that sort of stuff. Genuinely, the best thing you can do to reduce the pace of this virus spreading, but also just think about an older relation you might have, or somebody who who's got underlying health conditions. You may, if not yourself, have somebody who is pregnant. All these groups are vulnerable, but also we're vulnerable as well. And at the time we're recording this, already in London, almost 600 people have lost their lives who had COVID-19. At the time we're doing this interview, across the country, at least 1,200 people have died who had COVID-19. And across the globe, thousands and thousands have lost their lives. This is an invisible killer. And it's really important we treat it with the seriousness it deserves.
So, and something I'd like to talk about then is whether you know, first of all, I'll preface this by saying this is a state of emergency. You know, these are unprecedented times, and I know that the government is doing as much as it can to try and tackle this crisis. But there's a little part of me that wants to look at what was coming out of China in January, that people were being killed by this virus, that it had the potential to be a global pandemic. Why wasn't February spent buying the test kits, buying the personal protective equipment that our NHS workers are desperately in need of? Do you think it can be said that the government took this seriously enough themselves in the first place?
I think there are lots of questions. You've articulated one that will need to be answered when this virus is over. I think actually one of the great things about living in a democracy is we challenge those in positions of power and influence, whether it's the Prime Minister, the Mayor, the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer, the Health Secretary. That leads to, I think, better decisions being reached because we are challenged on the decisions we've made. And I think one of the things we should ask ourselves is, were those in positions of power properly challenged at the right time? And when this is over, there will need to be, some people call it a reckoning, whether it's a public inquiry or whatever. But these are legitimate live questions that many of us have. This isn't something that happened overnight and it just, came upon us. We knew this was coming, and one of the saving graces is that it's arrived on our shores later than other parts of the world. So we could see what was going on, learned what worked, and avoided what didn't work. And so the obvious question that people are asking, and I've been asking, is why didn't we order the testing equipment a long time ago? Why didn't we have protective equipment ready and available? Why wasn't there more contact tracing, and on and on and on? Big questions about lack of message clarity, about not leading by example. And so look, at the moment, my job as the Mayor is to work really closely with the government, of course, challenge privately where I'm unhappy, push them further where I can. But all of us have got to unite in fighting this virus. But that doesn't mean these aren't serious questions that demand answering. This doesn't mean we just, carte blanche, let people like me or the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary or others get away with plans that don't withstand scrutiny. I think they should be scrutinised. And I think when this is over, there'll be serious, big questions that demand answers.
Let's explore then some of the things that you're responsible as the Mayor of London. I think one of the things that people have found most concerning, at least in the short time that this pandemic's been developing in this country, are photos from the tube, seeing congested platforms, congested trains, and I think Matt Hancock had a little dig at you as well, sort of about the level of the number of services that we're running. Can you explain why we're seeing those scenes on the tube and what you're doing to limit the number of people using it?
Well, let's put aside the childish political knockabout from Matt Hancock and deal with the grown-up stuff first. Look, we have on Transport for London, and actually you speak to the NHS, you speak to others, large numbers of people who aren't at work for a variety of reasons. One, because they themselves may have COVID-19 symptoms, or because they're following government advice and a member of their family has symptoms and they're self-isolating for 14 days. One of my frustrations is because of the lack of availability of the testing equipment, not just for the NHS, but for the police, transport workers and others, people who may not themselves have COVID-19 having to isolate for 14 days when they could be back out there as they want to be working. So we have, roughly speaking, around 30% of TfL staff who, for a variety of reasons, aren't at work, 30%. Now, we're providing the largest number of tubes, buses, trams and overground we can safely provide, because some of the jobs that those who are absent do isn't just driving the tubes, but they're safety critical. And so what we wouldn't want to like to have is, God forbid, an accident caused by lack of safety. It's really important. So we've got, roughly speaking, 56% of tubes running, roughly speaking 90% of buses running, and public transport is running as best as it can. The problem is that too many people who really should be working at home aren't, and if they really need to go to work, they're not avoiding the rush hour. And so actually the reason why public transport is still running is for critical workers, the NHS, police, transport workers, firefighters, social care, etc. And again, one of my frustrations is the lack of clarity from the government about who should be working. So one of the reasons why I've been quite clear that only those who are safety critical construction workers should be working, is to have fewer people out and about spreading the virus and fewer people using public transport. There is some good news. If you compare public transport usage now versus this time last year, the tube's down about 94%, bus down about 85%, and comparing today to this time last week, we're still down about 10% on both. So we're making good progress. The key pinch points is rush hour. And my key ask is please don't use public transport unless you really have to use it during rush hour. And so when you see British Transport police officers present around stations, or when you see staff in high-vis tops or police officers, they're there to control numbers. We have fewer people using public transport at this difficult time.
It's interesting to hear you say that sort of we're down to about we've got lost 30% of TfL staff, and so the services have been affected in this way. Because I wanted to ask you about the Met Police. Reports today in the Times that police forces may have to ignore low-level crimes because of officers being absent due to sickness, and the figures actually quoted there that they were worried about was if they were getting to that 20 to 30% threshold in various forces across the country, and then what might happen. So what sort of level of staff absence and sickness is there in the Met? Is it comparable to TfL? And what's your contingency plan for if we are seeing those low level of officers? How are you going to maintain law and order in the city?
Yeah, that's right. I speak a number of times during the day with the Met Police Commissioner, and the good news about the Met Police Service is we're pretty resilient because over last year and the year before we had so few officers. We had, I think, less than 30,000, the fewest number since 2003. We can flex to do our best to keep our city safe with fewer officers. At the moment, we're okay. The Commissioner has asked those who've recently retired to rejoin, and we, as of speaking, have about 250 plus who have applied to rejoin. We're also asking those who are about to retire if they could defer their retirement and stay on a bit longer just to keep the numbers up. And during the course of this week, another 350 new officers will be graduating. So at the moment, we're okay. Clearly, what I don't want is officers being diverted from core policing functions to enforce the inverted commas lockdown. I think police officers should be dealing with organised crime, those who are involved in carrying knives, and those involved in the most serious elements of the criminal spectrum, rather than having to enforce the rules around the lockdown. So what the Met Police are doing, unlike other police forces I understand around the country, is using the enforcement rules as a last resort. But if you're out and about and you see a police officer and he or she says to you, what are you doing out and about, and asks questions or tries to break up gatherings of more than two people, that's for a very simple reason, that actually spreading the virus is leading to more people dying, and that's why they're doing that. Not because police officers necessarily per se, particularly enjoy sending people home, but I'd ask all your viewers to please, respect the police at this difficult time, but also respect the rules. They're there for a very good reason. It's
a bit of a contrast there in sort of your critique, your view of the government in basically being not heavy-handed enough, but not being explicit enough, if you like, in the way that it's advising the country. But yet, conversely, the Met, the police force that you're in charge of, actually being a lot softer than other police forces who are using drones, employing roadblocks, more draconian measures, really. And yet the police force here in London, that's not the case. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
First of all, what I'd remind your viewers about is the right to life is intrinsic in the human rights legislation. It's Article 2 of the European Convention. It's really important, and all other rights flow from that. And so, as somebody who's a proud advocate of human rights, it's an essential human right in relation to the right to life. Sometimes, and the human rights jurisprudence is deliberately drafted in a way to flex, to respect the circumstances going on. And so, what I'm clear about is the police are in an invidious position because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. So, for example, if they are seen to be exercising discretion and trying to explain to people why these rules are there and persuading them to go home, they're criticised for being too soft. If they're on the other hand using drones to be on the lookout for people abusing the rules, they're accused of being draconian and going over the top. And all I'd say to everyone is these are extraordinary times, and they call for extraordinary measures. I never wanted to be the mayor at a time when we're planning for emergency mortuary provision, or the mirror time where I'm supporting the police enforcing rules to say go home, even though you've done nothing wrong, in terms of criminal legislation. But these are extraordinary times, and all I'd say is these numbers that we talk about, almost 600 deaths in London, more than 1,200 in the country. These aren't just numbers. These are people who've lost their lives prematurely, whose families are grieving. And so the rules are there for a reason. And the police's job is to enforce the rules because, we need clarity. And one of my frustrations has been the lack of clarity, from the Prime Minister and others over the last few weeks, the mixed messages. And that's why having the police enforce these rules, I hope, gives clarity that these aren't optional. Stay at home unless there are exceptional reasons why you've got to leave. And there's only 4 reasons why you should be leaving home. 1, because you're going to the shop to buy essential provisions. 2, because you're going to go to the doctor or drop off medicines to a loved one. 3, because you're having your exercise no more than once a day, please. Or 4, because you really, really, really can't work from home and you're going to work or back home from work.
So let's talk a little bit more about the contingency measures, because there's the one eventuality where if a significant amount of officers are off sick, whether it's because family members have symptoms, they've got to self-isolate, whatever, they're absent from work because of that. But there's also the possibility of public unrest, civil disorder and rioting. And as you've mentioned many times before in the past, limited police resources, limited amount of officers. What is the contingency if those strains are placed on the force? How are you going to fill the gaps? How are you going to plug the gaps and maintain law and order?
Just to reassure your viewers, the great thing about the Met Police Service is they've got huge experience of policing a global city. We are an international and capital city. We've got many protests take place each year, state visits, sporting events, cultural events. And so we've got the experience to adapt. And so often it can lead to a situation where an officer is doing this job, is moved and extracted to do another job. Or sometimes, enabled police officer can be extracted to do another job. So there's a huge amount of expertise and flex there. But also one of the things that the police forces across the country have, there's 43 police forces, is something called mutual aid. What mutual aid means is if there are times where police force A is under real pressure and can't cope, police force B, C, D, E, F, they all chip in and help out that police force go through difficult times. So even if, worst case scenario, the Met Police Service, and we've now got more than 31,000 officers, couldn't cope, and I don't foresee that happening. The great thing is mutual aid means other forces would come and help out. The other great thing about the Met Police Service is officers often are asked to and do overtime, and often leave is cancelled, and officers are told they can't take holidays to help out. And so, I'm one of the biggest fans of our under-resourced and overstretched police, but also I'm confident that we've got the experience and flexibility to cope with COVID-19. But, I want the police to be focusing on organised crime and violent crime rather than being diverted to deal with COVID-19 issues. But, the police are there to keep the peace. And one of the great sayings of the founder of the modern police service, Robert Peel, was the police are the public and the public are the police. And so all of us have a role to play in keeping the peace. And
presumably those criminal elements aren't paying very much regard to government advice about staying at home, self-isolating.
Absolutely, as you'd expect. They don't follow, criminal legislation and criminal rules, let alone COVID-19 rules. But also, actually, we know from history, if you speak to historians and scholars who know about the Second World War, actually, rationing and curfews, all the rest of it, was an opportunity for criminals who wanted to prosper, and people now are taking advantage. I've heard stories about unscrupulous people knocking on doors of older people, offering to buy shopping and taking money from them and never returning. Others selling dodgy products that aren't really hand sanitizers, and on thefts of commercial properties, as there are a few people working there. So the police have got to deal with crime that's directly related to COVID-19 as a consequence of COVID-19, but also organised criminals are still, organising crime. Those who carry a knife or a gun are still carrying the knife and a gun and going about our streets and all the rest of it. So it's really important. All of us are vigilant, and the police are never complacent.
Something else I'd like to talk to you about is the homeless. The health of our nation right now relies on everyone. social distancing, and for obvious reasons that provides a pretty big problem for the homeless. In fact, we're now reliant on those that our society has neglected and forgotten for so long to follow the rules like everyone else. What are you doing as Mayor of London to help our homeless friends?
I've always believed that you judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable, and rough sleepers are the most vulnerable in our society at the moment. Why? Because not only are rough sleepers often people who have underlying health conditions that can make them really vulnerable to COVID-19, but also actually one of the jobs of outreach workers is to try and find a rough sleeper and then take them to a hostel or somewhere safe. Often these are dormitory facilities. And so the irony is somebody will take a rough sleeper who may have underlying health conditions to a dormitory or a communal space where they could spread the virus or catch the virus. So one of the things that we've been doing from City Hall for the last few weeks is working with hotels that are currently empty, for obvious reasons, university campuses, to try and use them as almost like self-isolating places for rough sleepers. And we're also working really well with black cabs who are currently less busy. And so the black cabs are driving the rough sleepers from the hostels to the hotels. And as we speak, I'm really pleased to say we have about 500 rough sleepers currently in hotels, student accommodation, etc. But also councils across London are also now doing the same thing for those sleeping rough in their own patches, because actually if a rough sleeper catches the virus, because many of underlying health conditions, they can be really vulnerable to, some of the worst consequences of COVID-19. And we've also set up at these hotels and student accommodation health provision and other help that often rough sleepers need. One of the big things for those rough sleepers who've got a dog is a concern that certain places won't allow the dog to go as well. So we've made sure there is provision for people who are rough sleepers and have a dog to be able to take their pet as well. But it is a challenge. We're trying to make sure as many rough sleepers as possible are off the streets. The irony again is often I'd say to you, listen, if you see somebody sleeping rough, go to StreetLink, the app, and let us know. But because I'm telling you to stay at home, you're not out and about spotting a rough sleeper. So we're trying our best to find the rough sleepers and get them to hotels. And it's really important. We realise many rough sleepers who, if they catch COVID-19, they really will struggle with it.
There's all sorts of elements of this crisis that are changing our politics significantly, hugely. But I think there are potentially some silver linings here, change things for the better. For example, an appreciation for carers, cleaners, typically people who had been described in the past as low skilled. Also, I think here, this demonstrates, right, if we can take care of these homeless people in sickness, why can't we take care of them in health? That's a valid question that this raises, right?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, the anomalies there are in our society, the unfairness, whether it's those who are self-employed in the gig economy on 0 hours contract, people suddenly realise how difficult it is. The cleaners are essential to the public transport being safe. And so one of the first things we did when the virus first began is to make sure the cleaners who work for a separate company were given proper safeguards. So if they had to go off sick or self-isolating, they were paid properly. It's really important we do so. But actually, it shouldn't take COVID-19 for us to realise that it ain't right that there are so many people sleeping rough on the streets of the fourth richest city in the world. It can't be right that it takes at minimum 5 weeks to get universal credit. It can't be right. We've got so many people who are the victims of domestic abuse and domestic violence, and we're now waking up to the consequences of people working at home, the abuser, what that means to those suffering domestic violence, domestic abuse, and on and on and on. It can't be right. We only have 800 intensive care unit beds in a city like London, which is why we now have got a temporary hospital having to be built in the XL centre. It can't be right that frontline workers like the NHS haven't got basic protective equipment to stop them getting the virus. As we speak, already 3 doctors have lost their lives. 3 doctors doing their job, looking after people who are unwell, have caught the virus and lost their lives. And so there are a lot, as we said when we began this conversation, there'll be big questions that will be asked about the government's handling of the virus. But I think actually there should be big questions asked about our society and how we just, how we distribute finite resources, and are we spending these finite resources in the best places?
I think there will be healthcare workers, maybe recently retired, volunteers, the like, who will be thinking this week about whether they want to put their hand up and say, I'm going to go to Nightingale, I'm going to go to NHS Nightingale, I'm going to help out, my brothers and sisters in this country, in this city, who are suffering from this disease. But they face a dilemma, right, don't they? Because we know that the personal protective equipment that the government is providing is not up to World Health Organization standards. It is not the tight, the snug, face-fitting mask, the proper goggles, all the rest of it. We've seen photos of nurses having to use bin bags and the like. What's your message to a healthcare worker, someone who's recently retired, someone who's thinking about volunteering in a time like this, where they may well be seriously considering putting their own safety at risk to help others?
NHS staff, frontline workers are heroes. They're stepping up to serve on the front line in our hour of need. And, from the bottom of my heart, I say thank you. You're a credit to our city and our country, and we need you. I'm so proud when I hear that there are more than 750,000 people who have volunteered to help during this difficult time. Many of them are our family and friends. I'm so proud when I hear there are 20,000 retired NHS workers who are coming back to serve on the front line. I'm so proud when I hear there are more than 250 retired police officers who have come back in the Met Police Service to help out. Loads retired from TfL coming back to help out. But, this is a difficult time, and we need all hands to the pump. And that's why I'm so angry, because there's something called the military covenant. What the military covenant basically is we've got to deal with our military. And the deal goes like this. In return for you serving in the armed forces, the military covenant is the government will give you the right kit you need and look after you and your loved ones. That's basically what it is. Well, I think similarly, there should be a covenant with those who are stepping up. And the government should be saying to those who are stepping up, you know what, the basic deal is, we'll give you the right kit, make sure that you're looked after and your loved ones looked after. And I think the government's breaching that. And that's why it's really important. I will carry on lobbying, challenging the government behind the scenes. In the meantime, let's all work together to deal with and defeat this virus.
Yeah, it's if you're going to ask people to put themselves in jeopardy, I suppose it is that it's the least you can do. Just a couple more questions, Sadiq. So, I wanted to talk to you about the potential. We know that London is at the moment the epicenter of the virus in our country right now, and I wondered if you had explored, to what extent you had explored the possibility of. I know we say we're in lockdown now, but a very formal, very strict lockdown of London. And when I say the city of London, I don't just mean the square mile. I mean our entire city, the 12 million people who live here. To what extent have you been considering separating our city away from the rest of the country? If the virus is so heavily concentrated here, potentially that's an appropriate public health measure to take.
So one of the things that I did some time ago was to see what other cities and what other countries are doing around the world in relation to coronavirus. One of the reasons I've been lobbying the government on a variety of things is not just because of a whim, because I've seen what others are doing and I've taken advice, and I've been lobbying the Prime Minister and others to move a certain way. We, London, are 2-3 weeks ahead of the rest of the country. And as a country, we're moving faster than we predicted, the experts had predicted. The so-called peak, in other words, the worst of the virus, is between 2 and 4 weeks away. Some people say 3 and 5 weeks away. It's not an exact science. And one of the reasons why I've asked for additional resources in London is because we know we're going to get it first. And so we need it now, whether it's testing, whether it's the PPE equipment, whatever it is. And so all options are being explored as far as I'm concerned. And I'll continue to make sure all options are explored. At the moment, it seems that by and large, we are following the rules and instructions. What I'm told is that the new measures which were introduced about a week ago, just over a week ago, it takes 2 weeks to see the impact of that on epidemiology in relation to what's happened in relation to that. So we'll have a good idea 2 weeks from when the new rules began, and we'll see whether we've managed to reduce the curve going this way, and then we'll try and see if we can push it down. So that's the time when we can see what needs to be done, whether the new rules are working or whether there's a need for a further change of rules. But it's important all this is kept under review. None of us should be dogmatic in relation to our response to COVID-19.
There's the deputy chief medical officer in the presser yesterday was saying words to that effect, that it's likely that when the measures are relaxed, they'll probably be done bit by bit. It probably won't all be at the same time. It will be a sort of a drip feeding, and I guess in the same way things could actually be tightened, and more strict legislation, advice, guidance could also be implemented in that way, right? So whether it's a curfew, whether it's an end on travel or any of those things, they could be implemented individually rather than a big single measure.
So what the Prime Minister did was he did the new measures and said, let's review them after 3 weeks. I think that's the right thing to do. You suck it and see. So we've begun this. Let's review it after 3 weeks, and at that 3 week stage, we can see whether further measures need to be taken or whether there can be a relaxation of some of the measures. I'm quite clear, though. Yes, this is an economic emergency. Yes, this may be a social emergency, but most importantly, it's a public health emergency. It's a crisis. And so that's the priority for me. And so that's why I say, unless you are a construction worker doing with safety stuff, you should be at home, right? But others disagree and think, the economy needs to carry on moving and all the rest of it. And so there's a difference of opinion. But, when I see numbers, they're not numbers to me. They're people who've lost their lives. They're families who are grieving. And I know that, yes, the brilliant NHS, the heroic Frontline team are saving countless lives. I mean, many lives. But I also know there are countless lives that have been lost and families that are grieving. That's why, for me, the priority has got to be the public health emergency. And I'll carry on focusing on that when it comes to my interactions with the government. Yeah, we're working close together as a team. It's really important we work together to defeat this. But, I'm not afraid to challenge when decisions need challenging.
How long do you think we can expect these lockdown conditions, measures to be in place? Obviously, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer yesterday said it's very flexible. It could be between 3 to 6 months. It's very difficult to say. What sort of timescales are you looking at for these measures? Are we looking at next year, for example? Is there potential for another bump in this virus and cases in the winter? What sort of timeframes are we dealing with here?
Firstly, anybody who gives you a certain answer is not to be believed. Right? Don't believe them. This is an area developing all the time. So, for example, the question we should ask is what's happened to China and those parts of South Korea who lifted some of the measures they had there? Did the virus come back? Was there two upside down U's, two bell curves? And so we're going to wait and see what happens. What I do know is actually one of the reasons we were keen to contain and delay was to move the peak of the virus to spring and summer. Why? Two main reasons. One, because the NHS is under huge pressure in the winter, and so we wanted to free up some capacity from the NHS, ICU beds, ventilators, staff, which will be freed up in spring and summer. That's the first reason we were trying to push the peak that contained the delay. But secondly, because we're not sure how the virus behaves in hot weather. We're hoping it spreads less fast in the hot weather. So we genuinely should review after every short period of time, whether it's 3 weeks, whether it's 2 weeks. We should review how it's working and then adapt. What I'm clear about is we've showed that we can adapt quite well. And even though we live in a thriving democracy, we accept by and large that this is the right thing to do. Yeah, some of our rights have been curtailed and civility has been curtailed, but they're for the greater good to stop the virus spreading as fast as it has. So look, I'm supportive of measures that help us defeat the virus. I'm supportive of the government working closely with them by and large to do what we can to deal with COVID-19. And also I think we should learn from other cities and other parts of the world. I was in a meeting last week on through the internet using Zoom with I think 70 mayors from around the world, from Jakarta to LA to cities in China to Paris, Milan, to learn from each other to see what works and to avoid the mistakes made by other cities as well.
Just one final question. I know you've got your time is short for you, but on that point, you mentioned other mayors there. The mayor of New York, something he said that I thought was very emphatic and very powerful was that we don't want one single New Yorker to die. Now, I know that the situation is moved beyond that, and obviously the situation in London has moved beyond that. But I wondered if you wanted to echo that sentiment, to sort of your message to Londoners now in what is almost an unprecedented time and a time of real crisis.
Look, our generation has never faced anything like this. These are extraordinary times, and they call for extraordinary measures. But we're a city that has been through plagues. We've been through great fires. Our city that went through the Blitz. We went and endured periods of being under terror attacks. So look, we're going to come through this. And if anybody's in any doubt that we're going to come through this, look at that remarkable time at 8 o'clock last week on Thursday, when we applauded for our carers, clapped for carers. I mean, genuinely, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was so proud looking outside my window, clapping at not just my street, but streets across our city, applauding our NHS heroes. Think about those who volunteered to go back to the front line, even though they've retired, and those who volunteered to help deliver provisions for the elderly and those who are vulnerable. So look, we're going to get through this. But we've got to get through this by working together. So please follow the advice. Stay at home unless you've got a really, really good reason to leave. And that way we can stop the spread of the virus and hopefully have fewer people losing their loved ones.
Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, thank you very much for taking the time.
Stay safe.